All right, so today we are talking about grace. Um, and just before jumping into this is a tough one to introduce because grace is such a familiar word, um, and yet it's vague. It's very churchy. If you grew up in the church, you probably heard the word, that we're saved by grace, or that we're supposed to show grace. You hear about grace a lot. It's a familiar term, but it's vague, and I suspect that the word by itself doesn't have much of an impact on us the way it should. But what I want to do with this is I want to this is just kind of an outline of where I'm going. I want to address how grace applies to our everyday lives, especially in the context of marriage, and how this grace and how it's the grace of God, how it relates to the way we live with and understand our spouses. So I just want to zoom in on what grace is, how it applies in our marriages. Simple stuff, but when you get specific with it, it gets pretty convicting, I guess would be a fair way to say it. So I've got a very simple definition of grace. Grace is undeserved favor. That's your first blank on your notes. Grace is undeserved favor. Um, the verse that very first verse that came to my mind for this: all have sinned. This is Romans 3:23 and 24. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and are justified by His grace, by the grace of God, as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. Now, I hope you know this as you're sitting here. We are saved by grace, meaning God has given us undeserved favor and extending the opportunity to be in a relationship with Him, to be saved. According to, it's not just grace that saves us. I'd say according to countless passages, it's also grace that transforms us. That God gives us undeserved favor day to day, not just in salvation. And I looked up its definition. I'm going to put it up here. This is from the Baker Encyclopedia of the Bible. Okay, so this is the definition of grace. Grace is the dimension of divine activity that enables God to confront human indifference and rebellion with an inexhaustible capacity to forgive and to bless. And then it concludes and it says, God is gracious in action. And when I read that definition, it goes on to say that God never gives grace begrudgingly, meaning He doesn't tire of giving grace. He is gracious. He gives it cheerfully. He loves to give grace. But what I want to do with this definition here is that I think it's pretty amazing to think of the God of the universe, who's all powerful, who's going to judge the world, all this stuff. He is a God who meets humans who are indifferent toward Him, even rebellious toward Him. He has this inexhaustible capacity to forgive and to bless, and He doesn't get tired of giving that kind of grace. If you think about how that applies to a God who's as powerful as God, it melts you. I wish I could just, magically cause all of our hearts to be amazed by that. But that's something that I think it's Romans 2, chapter 2, verse 4 says, God's kindness leads to repentance. Like the fact that God is gracious is what changes our hearts, and it's what melts us and softens us and causes us to want to follow Him. Okay, that's the grace of God. That's how we stand in relationship with Him. But I want to take a step to the right here and say, how does that apply in marriages? And I took a little creative liberty, and I changed this definition and added in some words just to apply grace in marriage. Because this is God's grace in marriage. Grace in marriage is a result of divine activity that enables recipients of grace, you and me, to confront their spouse's differences, or maybe their spouse's indifference, their spouse's shortcomings, and your spouse's sin, with an inexhaustible capacity to forgive and to bless. Christian spouses are gracious in action. Because God's been gracious to us, He's called us to be gracious toward one another. And this is just an attempt to spell out what that might look like. When God's activity of grace in us allows us to be gracious to spouses who are different from us, sinful, I mean, all this stuff, and have this inexhaustible capacity to show that kind of grace. And then it concludes by saying Christian spouses are gracious in action. So, what in marriage, where do we need to put grace into action? And this is where I want rubber to meet the road. You're going to hopefully hear where things apply to you specifically. So, yeah, where are we supposed to be gracious in action? Well, the first area, I didn't mean to stop sharing the screen here. The first area, and it's going to be your next blank, is we need to show grace where we are hardwired differently by God. We need to show grace to our spouse in areas that we are created to be different by God. We're different from one another because God made us that way. And sure, we all know that, but think about it. You are different from your spouse in at least two big ways. One, God gave you very different personalities. He gave you different gifts, different tastes, different everything, personalities. I mean, just he made you different, and then also he made you different in gender, right? These differences about your spouse came about in the mind of an incredibly creative designer. God wasn't locked into one model of what a human being is supposed to be like. So if you look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, God, looking at Adam, there's no sin in the world, and everything he created was good. But then he looked at Adam and he saw that Adam was alone, and he said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him or suitable for him." When you look up what the word helper means, in bringing Adam a spouse, bringing him a wife, he brought him a helper. Well, this definition of helper is one who supplies strength in the area that is lacking in the helped. The term does not imply that the helper is either stronger or weaker than the one helped. No, it's just different. Like the helper supplies strength in the area that is lacking in the one being helped. And then the term fit for him or matching him means he's not this person is not the same as, or he's not like him. So in other words, a wife is not her husband's clone, but rather a complement. God had in mind to create a complement for Adam. And in the same way, when he brought your spouse to you, when he brought you together, God hardwired you to be different from each other. And that was his intention. So let me just throw out some examples of ways that God hardwired you to be different from each other. Chances are one of you is a multitasker while the other one is very focused. Is that true? This is where, again, it's nice when we're all in the same room and I can see your heads nodding and all that stuff. So just know that I can see your heads. Nod or shake your heads if I'm off. But is one of you the multitasker and the other one's really focused? Or one of you is really distracted and the other one's really focused, is the way that should be translated. Is one of you the talker and the other one the listener, or the one who, well, you'd think I'm the talker in our marriage, but when I come home and I ask Brandy how her day was, she will give me a real-time replay of the day that blows my mind. It's like, I think real life real life goes faster. She'll tell me details. I'm like, how do you remember all this stuff? And early on in our marriage, when I didn't appreciate that much, there'd be times where I'd be like, okay, all right, land the plane here, where are we going? And it was really rude, but I wasn't appreciating how different we were. Okay, so one of you's a talker, one of you, often, not everybody. One of you is probably more organized, and the other one is maybe embraces clutter, if you will. Do you guys squeeze the toothpaste differently? That's one of you squeezes it like just in the middle, and the other one does it the right way by rolling it from the bottom. One of you is probably a planner while the other person's more spontaneous. Am I right on that? One of you, like Brandy is a planner, and there are times where if I suggest something on Saturday, like, hey, on Saturday we can do this, I can see the domino I just knocked over in the schedule, and I could see it stressing her out because she's such a planner. Um, Optimists, maybe married to realists or pessimists. Task people, social butterflies, wallflowers, extroverts, introverts. They're all ways that we're just hardwired to be different, and it's good. And I'm not even mentioning male and female. Consider the differences that our gender brings. Just in God's design, um, both of you process your world differently. I didn't even like mention like sex drives. I know that this is stereotypical and that there are plenty of exceptions, but there are many cases where I've heard pastors say men are like microwaves and women are like crock pots sexually, that like guys are just ready to go, and for a woman it's like it begins in the morning of like the way you greet each other. And it's okay, if that stereotype, which is often true, do you see, is God being cruel to us and making us that different? Or do you see his goodness in those differences? Um, you will never, I mean, you'll never marry your clone. In marriage, you will never be able to turn your husband or wife into the way the way you think they're supposed to be, more like you in a sense. And this is intentionally the case by the will of an all-wise God. How are you different from your spouse? And I'm not talking about areas of sin here. I'm just talking about ways that God made you different. How are you different? And then how do you think about those differences? Are you better than your spouse in the areas that you're different? Do you think that the ways your personality works are more respectful, more virtuous? That's not showing grace. If you mix these differences in an atmosphere devoid of grace, you've got a deadly minefield of relational conflict and failure, where all those differences have the potential to be a source of conflict. So we need to show grace where we are hardwired differently by God. And this next point is similar, but it's just a little different. We also need to show grace where we view and approach life differently. It's similar, but it's different. What I mean is, uh, God didn't make you different in these ways, but just our upbringings, our exposure to, how we grew up, our viewpoints, our instincts, our tastes have been formed from our upbringing, our experiences, our cultures, our relationship, those relational influences. They've formed the way we see the world, the way we respond to it. So some examples that come to my mind, how you view the holidays, how you spend your money. If one of you grew up rich while the other one grew up poor, you realize how different you're going to view money, right? What's acceptable? You probably have different views. I mean, you might have different views on what it means to be on time and what it means, um, to say if I'm going to be there at 10 o'clock. Well, for some people, it means I'll get there when I can, as close to 10 as possible. And the other people, chances are your spouse thinks that means I'll be there at 9:55. Um, Tim Keller is a pastor that he wrote a book. Well, I can't remember where I heard it. I just know it was him. He and his wife had a cultural difference that brought a lot of tension in their marriage. Um, Tim Keller's mom, I guess when he was growing up, she would fold the laundry and put it all away in the kids' drawers. And that's what he grew up exposed to. His mom would do the laundry, would fold it and put it away. Tim Keller's wife, Kathy, her mom would do the laundry, she'd fold it up and leave it at the base of the stairs for the kids to put away on their way upstairs to their rooms. Okay, that was a difference growing up. When they got married, what would happen would Tim's wife, Kathy, would do the laundry and would put it on the base of the stairs. And then I guess Tim said he would just walk past the laundry, or the kids would walk past the laundry. Now, what was happening in Tim's mind was, if my wife really loved us, she would put the laundry away. And what Kathy was thinking is, if the family really loved me, they would put the laundry away. They were looking at the exact same situation, but they had a different view from their upbringing on that thing. I'll give an example from our marriage. This happened really early on. My family was we were always probably overly diplomatic really kind to each other. Hey, when you get a second, we pass the salt. Just we would, everybody was kind of kind in the way they spoke. We might be mad at each other, but we weren't upfront about it. Brandy's family, they were just like drill sergeants, and they would just say it as it is. And hey, put that down. Yeah, hand that to me. And I would kind of think like, what's going on? Are they mad at each other? And there was no hard feelings whatsoever. Everybody was just a lot more direct. When we got married, we had a lot of arguments over things that were like, I would be thinking, why is Brandy mad at me? She's talking so straightforward and, in my mind, rude. And come to find out, she wasn't mad at all. Well, I came to realize that one time when we were on our way to Houston and going to see her mom. And this is like, we'd been married for a few months. And we were on our way, and her mom called, and Brandy's on the phone, and she said, all I knew is her tone changed halfway through the call. She said, "No, no, mom, no, I actually," and I started thinking like, I'm smelling blood here. Are they arguing? And I was kind of like, probably the gossip side of me was curious, like, what are they arguing about? So I was kind of leaning in, listening. And then all of a sudden she said, "Oh, okay, well, we'll see you soon. All right, love you, bye," and hung up the phone. And it occurred to me, like, what just happened there? I could have sworn Brandy was mad, and then she's not mad. And it just, her tone of voice does not always mean the same thing that I thought it meant. And those are areas that we're just view and approach life differently. Okay, so let me wrap these 2 points up because they're very similar. How do you show grace when you just simply are different? Here we go. And I stole this directly from Paul Tripp's book called What Did You Expect? It's a great book on marriage. How do you show grace where you are simply different? And these are blanks in your notes. First, in the areas you're different, celebrate your creator. You're not gonna find me trying to touch up the Mona Lisa. I'm not a better artist than Da Vinci, right? The more you look at your spouse and honor God as creator, the more likely you are to esteem and appreciate the person you live with who's different from you. So, God created your spouse. Celebrate your creator. Next, refuse to see these differences as right or wrong. I'm not talking about moral issues, but areas you've been hardwired to be different, or you're just culturally different. When you begin to think and act as though your hardwiring makes you better, more mature, more righteous than your spouse, you'll act and respond in ways that are dismissive and disrespectful. Third, choose to respond with appreciation and respect. It's a conscious choice to do that. Fourth, learn where your differences create difficulty and call yourself to unification work. I would never say that that's Paul Tripp language, not mine. But yeah, there are areas it's just going to be hard. And we've learned to schedule things together. As Brandy and I are different enough, we've had to make adjustments in the past and just, this is difficult, let's do this differently. And then fifth, admit where these differences challenge you to grow. Sometimes these are areas where it's like, yeah, this is where I'm being sanctified. But those are some steps on how to show grace where you are simply different. Okay, last point here. We need to show grace where we struggle with sin and weakness differently. This is huge. Let me just say it this way. I have an easy time showing grace, mercy, and compassion toward people when they either struggle with the same sins that I struggle with, or when their sins and weaknesses don't hurt me directly. Fair enough. If someone else struggles with lust, I struggle with lust. I'm pretty understanding. It's like, I get it. Okay. If it's Brandy telling me she's struggling with lust, that hurts me. Right? Or if someone tells me they struggle with being rude and impatient to their kids, I understand. But if they're rude and impatient to me, I'm going to have a hard time showing them grace. Here's what's hard about this. We all married someone who probably struggles with sin and weakness differently than us because they're different, and those sins hurt us directly. It's like it's both. It's really hard to show grace to our spouses because they struggle differently and it hurts us directly. And here's the thing, when we may not all struggle with sins in the exact same way, but we all struggle with the same sin. I think there's a great proof verse for that. It's Romans 2, verse 1. It says this. This is at the end of Romans chapter 1. Paul goes on he talks about the sin of the Gentiles who reject God. And it talks about just a list of like they're God haters. They invent ways of doing evil and they applaud people. And they talk about all these different types of immorality. And then chapter 2, there's no chapter break in Romans. It's just the next thing Paul says is, therefore you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same things. If you judge a person for being sexually immoral, it's like Paul's saying, actually, you do the same things. If you judge someone for being a God hater, you say, well, I don't hate God. No, Paul would say, yeah, you do the same things. You hate God in your heart when this happens. We're blind to the things that we do. When we see other people sin clearly, we tend to like judge them, but we forget that we're guilty of doing the same things. And what we tend to do is we make a caricature of the other person. We see them through their worst faults, and we interpret our own actions through a very like gentle stroke of the brush of like, I judge myself by my best intentions, and I judge others by their worst actions. So the heart, it automatically like this. When someone wrongs me, my heart automatically does this thing where I judge them strictly and completely and one-dimensionally in terms of the things that they've done. So if someone lies to me, they're a liar. When I tell a lie, it's different. It's complex. Well, I have a good reason for it. When someone does wrong, it's a little self-justification engine, and I immediately think I would never do that. I would never do something like that. So Brandy doesn't have the same fear of man that I do. I tend to be nicer to people. And sometimes Brandy will get like in task mode and come across as rude. And I would immediately think I would never be like that. But the truth is, if you take away my fear of man, I'm just as rude when I'm in task mode as Brandy. And so we just struggle. We struggle with the same sins. It just looks different. So we need to show grace where we struggle with sin and weakness differently. And if we humbly recognize that we ourselves are sinners in need of grace, it helps us give grace. That's why Paul says in Galatians 6:1, he says, brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness and humility. Keep watching yourself, lest you too be tempted. So let me just wrap this up here and just say these areas that we're called to show grace. I'm going to make a concluding observation here. Yeah, we need to show grace where we're hardwired differently by God, where we view and approach life differently, and where we struggle with sin and weakness differently. But it's interesting because only one of those areas is actually a category of grace. Like, if grace is undeserved favor, then we're not really giving undeserved favor when we are patient with someone who's different from us by God's design. It's not really undeserved favor to recognize that we're different. We view the holidays differently. No, this is the only area where it's like, you hurt me, you did wrong, and now it would only be fair for me to wrong you back. Well, this is the only area where we're really like showing grace, is where sin is where we've been sinned against. But the truth is, as recipients of God's grace. We've received an infinitely great amount of grace from him. We're in no position to even say that we're giving grace. According to Romans 13:8, we're in debt to God. When God gave us his grace, he says, love one another because I've given you grace, and now you owe it to one another to love one another. We're indebted to God. We owe it to God to give grace to one another because this is how God has loved us. He's given us amazing grace. It's his grace that calls us to learn to give grace. So change begins when we see the differences in our spouses, the differences that make life difficult sometimes. Those are really God's grace given to us. They're not obstructions of grace. They're opportunities for God to give us his grace. When you're tired and uncomfortable because you have to live with a person who's not like you, what you tell yourself about what's going on is really important. You have to preach the reality that God has given you a spouse to teach you what it means to be a recipient of grace and to give grace. It moves you from like resisting what God's doing to appreciating what he's doing. And where do we look for to get that grace? We look back to the cross. And while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. He gave us all the grace we would ever need, and that's what gives us the ability to give grace to one another. So that's my prayer, that we can internalize this, bask in God's grace for us so that we can show grace to one another. Let me pray. Father, thank you for the fact that you didn't wait for us to clean ourselves up, to become better, to try before giving us your grace. Romans 5:8, it says, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us, the righteous for the unrighteous. You gave us grace that we didn't deserve. And Lord, we've been forgiven of infinitely more than we will ever be called to forgive. So just would you refresh our hearts with the grace that you've given us, and the fact that you don't tire of giving us grace. You don't tire, you don't begrudgingly show us kindness and love. And so Lord, help us to just humble us with that so that we might have more and more ability to give grace to one another. And I pray that transforms our marriages. And I ask it all in Jesus' name. Amen.